March 15, 1987, Studio 6B at NBC Burbank. Harrison Ford walked onto Johnny Carson's set, sat down for the interview, and when the cameras stopped rolling, refused to shake the host's hand. 300 audience members saw it happen. 27 million viewers at home never knew why. What happened in the following 90 seconds changed everything. Ford whispered something to Johnny that made America's favorite host turn pale. Then he walked off the set without another word. The tape of those 90 seconds was sealed that night, locked away, forgotten. Until now. For 37 years, only 3 people knew what Harrison Ford saw backstage that night. 2 of them took the secret to their graves. The third one has been hiding in plain sight, carrying the weight of what Johnny Carson really was behind those charming smiles and perfectly timed jokes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Morrison's hands trembled as he stared at the unmarked package on his doorstep, the morning Los Angeles sun casting long shadows across his Pasadena apartment building's cracked concrete. 37 years. He'd managed to stay invisible for 37 years, and now someone knew where to find him. The package was small, manila, with his name typed on a label. No return address, no postmark he could make out. Frank's 71-year-old knees protested as he bent to retrieve it, his eyes scanning the empty hallway behind him. The building was quiet, except for Mrs. Chen's television bleeding through the thin walls, some morning talk show where everyone laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. He'd heard that same hollow laughter for decades. It never stopped reminding him. Inside his apartment, Frank set the package on his kitchen table next to yesterday's untouched crossword puzzle. The place was a museum of failure, Emmy Awards gathering dust on crooked shelves, framed photographs of him with celebrities whose names younger people wouldn't recognize, stacks of industry magazines from the 80s that he couldn't bring himself to throw away. The glamour had faded to sepia tones and brittle paper. Frank had been The Tonight Show's head producer for 12 years. Johnny's right-hand man, the guy who made the magic happen behind the scenes while America's sweetheart delivered monologues that made the country forget its troubles for an hour each night. Frank had been somebody then, invited to parties in the Hollywood Hills, his phone calls returned, his opinion valued. That was before March 15, 1987, before Harrison Ford, before Frank learned what kind of man he'd been protecting all those years. The package sat unopened for 20 minutes, while Frank made coffee with shaking hands, his mind racing through possibilities. Only 3 people knew what really happened that night. Johnny died in 2005. The NBC executive who helped bury the tape, Gerald Hoffman, had a heart attack in his Beverly Hills mansion 2 years ago. Frank had read about it in Variety while standing in a grocery store checkout line, feeling equal parts relief and terror. That left him, the last witness, the last keeper of a secret that could posthumously destroy the most beloved figure in television history. Frank's fingers worked at the package's sealed edges. Inside, wrapped in bubble wrap like a precious artifact, was a VHS tape. No label, no markings. But Frank knew exactly what it contained even before he saw the folded piece of paper underneath. The note was typed on plain white paper. Time to tell the truth, Frank. The world deserves to know what Johnny Carson really was. You have 72 hours to decide, your version of the story or ours. We'll be in touch. P.S. Say hello to Sarah for us. Frank's blood turned to ice water. Sarah, his granddaughter, 26 years old and finally making a name for herself as an investigative journalist at the Washington Post. The only family member who still called, still visited, still believed Frank had chosen early retirement instead of exile. Sarah knew nothing about that night. Nothing about why her grandfather had vanished from Hollywood at the height of his career, why he lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment instead of the Malibu beach house he'd once owned, why he flinched whenever Johnny Carson's voice played on television. Frank stumbled to his ancient VCR, hands trembling as he inserted the tape. He hadn't watched it in over 2 decades, but he remembered every frame. The static cleared, revealing the familiar Tonight Show set in those final moments after the audience had been dismissed, but before the crew finished breaking down. There was Johnny, still in his chair, adjusting his tie with that practiced ease. And there, barely visible in the shadow stage left, was 22-year-old Miranda Walsh, the intern who'd started 3 weeks earlier. Bright-eyed, eager to please, thrilled to be working on the most important show in television. Frank watched himself in the grainy footage, standing frozen behind camera 2 as Johnny approached Miranda. Watched himself do nothing as his mentor, America's favorite host, cornered the young woman against a equipment rack. Watched the fear bloom across Miranda's face. Watched Johnny's hands move where they shouldn't. Watched her try to push him away. And Frank watched himself make the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The choice to stay silent, to protect the show, to protect Johnny, to be complicit. Harrison Ford had seen it too, had confronted Johnny during their handshake moment. That's what the whispered words were about. That's why Ford walked away. And that's why the tape had to disappear. But someone else had a copy now. Someone who knew about Sarah. Frank ejected the tape with violent force, his chest tight with panic. Whoever sent this wasn't interested in money or fame. They wanted him to confess publicly, to destroy Johnny's legacy and his own granddaughter's career in the process. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through his racing thoughts. Frank stared at it, knowing with absolute certainty that his 37 years of hiding were over. The ringing continued, insistent and threatening, as Frank realized he was being hunted by someone who held all the cards. Frank's hand hovered over the phone, the shrill ringing echoing off the water-stained walls of his apartment. 4 rings, 5. On the 6th, he snatched the receiver. Hello? Silence stretched across the line, punctuated only by the faint hum of distance. Then a digitally altered voice, mechanically neutral, neither male nor female, spoke with deliberate slowness. You watched it. Frank's throat constricted. What do you want? Justice, Frank. Something you denied Miranda Walsh 37 years ago. The line went dead. Frank stood frozen, the dial tone droning in his ear like a flat line. His legs gave way, and he collapsed into the threadbare recliner that had been his anchor through decades of sleepless nights. The same chair where he'd held Sarah as a baby while his daughter worked double shifts at the hospital. The same chair where Sarah had curled up beside him as a child, listening to his sanitized stories about the glamorous world of television. Sarah, 26 now, with her mother's fierce intelligence and her grandfather's stubborn pursuit of truth. She called every Sunday at precisely 2 o'clock Pacific time, her voice bright with updates about her latest investigation or questions about family history that Frank deflected with practiced ease. Last week she'd been excited about a story she was chasing, something about government contractors and missing funds. Her career was finally gaining momentum after years of covering city council meetings and school board disputes. One revelation about her grandfather's past would obliterate everything she'd worked for. Frank's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece where a single photograph sat among the dusty awards. Sarah's journalism school graduation 3 years ago. She stood radiant in her cap and gown, arm linked through his, both of them grinning at the camera. It was the last time Frank remembered feeling genuinely proud of anything. He'd driven 8 hours to Sacramento to watch her walk across that stage, sitting alone in the auditorium while other families filled entire rows. The apartment felt suddenly suffocating. 37 years of accumulated silence pressed down on him like sediment, layer upon layer of unspoken truth. The Emmy for Outstanding Variety Series from 1984 caught afternoon light streaming through his blinds, its golden surface tarnished with neglect. Frank remembered the night he'd won it, Johnny clapping him on the back at the after-party, calling him the best damn producer in the business. The memory felt contaminated now, poisoned by everything he'd learned 3 years later. His coffee had grown cold, a skin forming on its surface. Frank stared into the murky liquid, remembering how Johnny had always insisted on a specific blend from a roaster in Beverly Hills, Ethiopian beans, medium roast, never bitter. Frank had known Johnny's preferences better than his own family's. Johnny's allergies, his superstitions, his ritual of touching his tie before every monologue. Frank had believed he understood the man completely. The apartment building groaned around him, pipes settling, Mrs. Chen's television providing a constant murmur of manufactured cheer. Frank had moved here in 1988, choosing the anonymous beige complex specifically for its mediocrity. No doorman to recognize him, No valet to remember his name. Just a quiet place where a former somebody could disappear into the rhythm of ordinary days. He pulled out his phone, a basic model Sarah had insisted he upgrade to last Christmas, and scrolled to her contact. Her photo smiled back at him, taken during their last dinner together in December. She'd driven down from San Francisco between assignments, surprising him with Chinese takeout and updates about her boyfriend David, a photographer she'd met while covering a water rights story in Fresno. Frank's thumb hovered over her name. What would he say? How could he explain that the grandfather she'd idolized had spent 37 years protecting a predator, that every comfortable lie he'd told about early retirement was actually a monument to his own cowardice? The shadows in his apartment were lengthening, afternoon bleeding toward evening. In 3 hours, Sarah would call for their weekly check-in. She'd ask about his health, his week, whether he was remembering to eat properly. She'd tell him about her latest article, seeking the approval that had become their Sunday ritual. Her voice would carry that note of gentle concern she'd developed since turning 25, the way she'd started treating him like something fragile that might break if handled roughly. Frank closed his eyes and let himself remember the good moments. Sarah's first steps in this very room, her chubby hands gripping his fingers, teaching her to play chess on rainy afternoons, the way she'd insisted on making him birthday cards well into her teens, elaborate constructions of glitter and construction paper that proclaimed him world's best grandpa in rainbow letters. He'd kept every single card. They sat in a shoebox in his bedroom closet, next to the only other thing he'd saved from his Tonight Show years, his final paycheck stub, dated March 30th, 1987. The phone remained silent in his hand, but Frank could feel time compressing around him like a vice. 72 hours to decide between protecting Sarah's future and confronting his past. Outside, the Los Angeles evening was beginning its slow descent toward darkness. Frank was still staring at his phone when the knock came. 3 soft raps against his door, barely audible above Mrs. Chen's evening game show. He froze in his recliner, phone clutched in his arthritic hands. Nobody visited him, ever. In 37 years, the only people who'd knocked on his door were delivery drivers with the wrong address, and Sarah on her increasingly rare visits. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as he shuffled to the peephole, his bare feet silent on the worn carpet. Through the fisheye lens, he saw a woman in her 50s standing in the hallway. Professional clothes, graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, a manila envelope tucked under her arm. She looked tired in a way that spoke of long flights and hotel coffee, but her posture was arrow-straight with determination. Frank knew that face. Older now, lined with decades of purpose he'd never possessed, but unmistakable. Miranda Walsh, the intern from that night. The woman whose life Johnny had tried to steal, whose trauma Frank had helped bury. His hand trembled on the deadbolt. 37 years of wondering if she'd survived, if she'd healed, if she'd found peace. He'd imagined this moment countless times, the confrontation, the reckoning, the price he'd always known he'd eventually have to pay. But in his mind, it had always been abstract, distant. Not this woman standing in his hallway at 7:30 on a Sunday evening, holding what looked like evidence. "Frank Morrison," she said through the door, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I know you're in there. I can see your shadow under the door." Frank pressed his forehead against the cool metal, closing his eyes. Miranda. "Dr. Walsh now," she corrected, and there was steel in her voice that hadn't been there when she was 22. "I need to talk to you. How did you find me?" "The same way I found the tape." A pause. "May I come in?" This conversation shouldn't happen in a hallway. Frank's fingers worked the locks. Deadbolt, chain, the doorknob lock Sarah had made him install after a rash of break-ins 3 years ago. Miranda stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over his museum of failure with clinical assessment. She'd become someone important, Frank realized. The uncertainty that had made her vulnerable was gone, replaced by the confidence of a woman who'd built something from ashes. "You kept them," she said, nodding toward his Emmy Awards. "I don't know why." "I do." She set her envelope on his kitchen table, right where the unmarked package had been that morning. "Guilt makes us collect evidence of who we used to be. I kept my Tonight Show ID badge for 15 years before I could throw it away." Frank remained by the door, afraid to move closer. The tape? You have the other copy? Copies. Plural. Miranda pulled out a chair and sat without invitation. I've had them since 1987. Gerald Hoffman wasn't as clever as he thought. When he bribed the camera operator to destroy the footage, he didn't realize the man had already made duplicates. Stephen Liu. You remember him? Frank did. Quiet kid, always wore headphones between takes. He'd disappeared from the show a week after the incidents, supposedly took a job in Portland. Stephen brought them to me 2 weeks later, Miranda continued. Said he couldn't live with what he'd seen. Said he'd tried to come forward, but NBC Legal had threatened him with lawsuits that would destroy his career. So he gave me the evidence and ran. Why didn't you use them? Miranda's laugh was bitter. I was 22 years old. Johnny Carson was God. Who would have believed me? Even with video evidence, they would have found ways to discredit it, to discredit me. So I waited. I went to law school, then got my doctorate in victims advocacy. I built a life where predators couldn't touch me. And I watched. Frank finally moved, his legs unsteady as he approached the table. Watched what? Johnny. For signs that there were others. For patterns. Miranda opened her envelope and spread out photographs, newspaper clippings, documents. There weren't any. Not that I could find. You want to know something funny, Frank? I think you saved other women by helping him cover it up. What? Johnny was terrified after that night. Harrison Ford's confrontation, Stephen Liu's camera catching everything, your obvious horror, it scared him straight. He never touched another intern. Never put himself in that position again. The guilt ate at him for years. Frank stared at the documents spread before him. Photos of Johnny in his later years, looking increasingly frail and haunted. Articles about his reclusive final decade. Medical records that somehow Miranda had obtained, showing prescriptions for antidepressants and sleeping pills. He tried to find me, Miranda said quietly. In 1999, 2 years before he got sick, hired private investigators. When they finally tracked me down, he wanted to meet, to apologize. Did you? No. Her voice was granite. Some things can't be apologized away. But I watched from a distance when he did. The guilt destroyed him slowly, Frank. Just like it's been destroying you. Outside, full darkness had fallen. Frank could hear his phone buzzing in the recliner. Sarah's weekly call, right on time. Answer it, Miranda said, because after we're done here tonight, everything changes. Frank's phone buzzed insistently from the recliner, Sarah's ringtone cutting through the tension like a blade. He stared at Miranda, then at the documents scattered across his table, paralyzed between his granddaughter's voice and the woman whose life he'd helped destroy. I can't, he whispered. Not with you here. Not with all this. Answer it, Miranda repeated, her tone brooking no argument. Act normal. But remember that after tonight, normal doesn't exist anymore. Frank's legs felt disconnected from his body as he shuffled to the recliner. Sarah's face smiled up at him from the phone screen. Last Christmas, her cheeks flushed with wine and laughter. His thumb trembled as he swiped to answer. Hi, sweetheart. Grandpa, you sound weird. Everything okay? Sarah's voice carried that familiar note of concern, the way she'd started monitoring his emotional state since he'd turned 70. You're not getting sick, are you? Just tired. Frank caught Miranda watching him with clinical interest, like a scientist observing a lab rat. How was your week? Crazy busy. I'm onto something big, actually. Remember that contractor story I mentioned? Well, it turns out there's this whole network of shell companies, and I think it goes all the way back to the Reagan administration. David thinks I'm becoming obsessed, but... Sarah paused. Are you sure you're all right? You're really quiet tonight. Frank closed his eyes, listening to his granddaughter's excitement about uncovering corruption, about following the truth wherever it led. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah had inherited his investigative instincts, his inability to let sleeping dogs lie. The same traits that had once made him an excellent producer now drove her relentless pursuit of stories that mattered. I'm proud of you, he managed. You know that, right? Grandpa, you're scaring me. What's going on? Nothing, Frank looked at Miranda, who was methodically organizing her documents. Sometimes I think about the past, about choices I made. You had an amazing career. Everyone says so. Everyone. Frank wondered who Sarah had been talking to, which of his former colleagues she'd contacted over the years. Most of them were dead now, or close to it. The lucky ones had simply forgotten him. The rest probably assumed he'd died years ago. Sarah, if something came out about me, something from a long time ago, would you still… Grandpa, stop. You're being weird. Did you watch the news today? Sometimes you get depressed when you watch too much news. Frank almost laughed. If only it were that simple. If only his problems could be solved by changing the channel or taking a walk around the block. I love you, he said instead. More than anything in this world. I love you too, and I'm worried about you. Maybe I should drive down next weekend. We could go to that diner you like, the one with the good coffee. Maybe. Frank's voice cracked. Next weekend felt impossibly far away, like planning a vacation on Mars. I should go. It's getting late. Okay, but promise me you'll call if you need anything. Promise me, Grandpa. I promise. After he hung up, silence filled the apartment like water rushing into a sinking ship. Miranda had finished organizing her papers and sat waiting with the patience of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. She sounds lovely, Miranda said. Smart, determined, like someone who values the truth. Don't. Frank's voice was raw. Whatever you want from me, leave her out of it. I'm not the one who brought her into this. Miranda pulled out a tablet, swiped to an email. This morning I received a message from someone calling themselves the Archive. They have copies of the tapes, Frank. They know about Sarah's career, her boyfriend David, where she lives in San Francisco. They're planning to release everything on March 15th, 40 years to the day. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Who are they? I don't know. But they're not amateurs. Miranda showed him the screen. The email was professionally composed, meticulously researched. It contained details about that night that only someone with intimate knowledge of the show could have known. They want us to come forward first, to control the narrative before they release their version. Their version? Think about it, Frank. Who else was there that night? Who else knew about the cover-up? Miranda's eyes were steady, unforgiving. Someone from inside. Someone who kept quiet all these years, but has decided that Johnny's death freed them from their obligation to silence. Frank's mind raced through the possibilities. Cameramen, sound technicians, writers, assistants. Dozens of people worked on the show, any of whom might have witnessed something or heard rumors. But the email's specificity suggested someone with access to executive-level decisions. I tried to ignore this, Miranda said quietly. For 37 years, I tried to move on. But whoever's behind this isn't going to let any of us run anymore. Outside, Mrs. Chen's television had gone quiet. The building settled into its evening routine of muffled conversations and distant footsteps. Frank realized that his careful, invisible life was about to become very public, very quickly. What do you want me to do? He asked. Miranda smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Stop hiding, Frank. Help me find them before they destroy us all. Frank stared at Miranda's tablet, the words blurring as his hands shook. 40 years to the day. Someone had chosen that anniversary deliberately, turning the calendar itself into a weapon. How long do we have? 18 days. Miranda's fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit that reminded Frank sickeningly of Johnny's pre-show rituals. The email came with a deadline. We have until March 1st to make our own statement, or they release everything with their commentary. What kind of commentary? Miranda scrolled through the message, her face grim. They're calling it The King's Last Secret, how Hollywood enabled Johnny Carson's darkest night. Complete with witness testimony, behind-the-scenes footage, and interviews with people who worked on the show. She looked up at Frank. Including you. I never gave any interview. They have surveillance footage from your building lobby, phone records, credit card transactions. Someone's been watching you for months, Frank, building a psychological profile. Miranda's voice carried the clinical detachment of someone who'd spent decades studying predators and their enablers. They know you go to Mel's Diner every Tuesday morning. They know you buy Sarah birthday presents at the same Hallmark store. They've documented your entire pathetic routine. The word hung in the air like smoke. Pathetic. Frank wanted to argue, to defend the small dignities of his exile, but Miranda wasn't wrong. His life had become a monument to avoidance, each day identical to the last, designed specifically to avoid making waves or drawing attention. "What about you?" Frank asked. "Are they watching you too?" "I assume so. But I have resources you don't. Security systems, legal protection, colleagues who know my history." Miranda gestured around Frank's cluttered apartment. "You're vulnerable, isolated, the perfect target for someone who wants to control the narrative." Frank thought about Stephen Liu, the young cameraman who disappeared after handing over the evidence. "You said Stephen brought you the tapes. What happened to him?" "He died in 1994. Car accident in Oregon." Miranda's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. Very convenient timing, considering he'd just started talking about writing a tell-all book about his time in Hollywood. The implications hit Frank like a physical blow. "You think someone killed him?" "I think Stephen Liu was a loose end that got tied up permanently, just like we're loose ends now." Miranda closed her tablet with a sharp snap. "Whoever's behind this has been planning for years, probably decades. They've waited for the right moment when all the major players are either dead or desperate enough to cooperate." Frank's apartment felt smaller with each revelation, the walls pressing closer like a slowly tightening fist. Through his window, he could see lights flickering on in other apartments, families settling in for the evening, people with normal problems and ordinary secrets. Mrs. Chen's television had resumed its evening programming, the cheerful sounds of a game show filtering through thin walls. "There's something else," Miranda said, pulling out a photograph Frank hadn't noticed before. It showed a man in his 50s, distinguished gray hair, expensive suit. "Recognize him?" Frank squinted at the image, his memory stretching back across decades of faces and names. Something familiar lurked in the man's features, but the years had made recognition elusive. "Should I?" "Gerald Hoffman's son, Marcus." Miranda's voice carried satisfaction at having surprised him. "He's a media executive now, owns 3 production companies, and has connections throughout the industry, including several major streaming platforms." The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. Gerald Hoffman, the NBC executive who'd orchestrated the cover-up, buying silence and destroying evidence. Frank had assumed Hoffman died years ago. Most of the men from that era were long gone, but their children remained, inheriting not just fortunes, but family secrets. "Marcus was 12 when his father died," Miranda continued, "old enough to remember whispered conversations, coded phone calls, the weight of carrying someone else's shame. Gerald spent his final years paranoid, convinced the truth would eventually surface. He prepared his son for this moment. You're saying Marcus is behind the archive? I'm saying he has motive, means, and opportunity. His father's reputation is still tied to Johnny's legacy. If the story comes out wrong, Gerald gets painted as the villain who enabled a predator. But if Marcus controls the narrative, he becomes the hero who finally exposed the truth," Frank finished. The elegant cruelty of it took his breath away. Marcus Hoffman could position himself as justice incarnate while destroying everyone who'd actually lived through that night. Frank's chest felt tight, his breathing shallow. 37 years of carefully constructed invisibility were crumbling, and Sarah would be caught in the avalanche. His granddaughter, who dedicated her career to uncovering corruption, would discover that her beloved grandfather was everything she'd built her life to oppose. "We need to find proof," Miranda said, standing to leave. "Real evidence of who's behind this. Because in 18 days, Frank, your granddaughter is going to learn exactly who you really are." The door closed behind Miranda with a soft click that sounded like the lid of a coffin. Frank stood frozen in the sudden silence, staring at the photographs scattered across his kitchen table. Marcus Hoffman's face gazed up at him with Gerald's same calculating eyes, and Frank felt the past rushing toward him like a freight train. His phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. "You have 17 days, Mr. Morrison. Choose wisely." Frank's hands trembled as he set the phone down. Whoever was watching him had waited until Miranda left to make contact. They wanted him isolated, vulnerable, forced to make decisions without allies or advice. He shuffled to his window and peered through the blinds at the street below. Every parked car looked suspicious now, every pedestrian a potential surveillance operative. The framed photograph on his mantel caught his eye. Sarah at her college graduation, radiant with possibility. Frank remembered that day, how proud he'd been when she announced her decision to study journalism. "I want to tell stories that matter, Grandpa. I want to make a difference." Now her grandfather's story would destroy everything she'd built. Frank pulled out the original unmarked package and examined it again, looking for clues he'd missed. The postmark was local, but that meant nothing. Anyone could drive to Pasadena to mail an envelope. The handwriting was careful, anonymous block letters designed to reveal nothing about the sender. But something nagged at him. The weight of the envelope, the precise way it had been sealed. Frank had received thousands of packages during his years as a producer, and this felt familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. He returned to his computer and pulled up Marcus Hoffman's company website. The executive photos showed a successful man in his 50s, but Frank found himself studying the background details. Awards on office walls, the particular way documents were arranged on the desk, the obsessive organization that reminded him of someone else entirely. Frank's breath caught. He clicked through to the company's history section, scanning for founding dates and early projects. Marcus Hoffman Productions, established 1987, the same year as the incident. A 12-year-old boy would remember that night differently than the adults involved. He would remember his father's panic, the late-night phone calls, the sudden change in household atmosphere. But he would also remember something else, the excitement of being included in a secret that important adults carried. Frank pulled out his old Tonight Show contact list, the one Miranda had mentioned. Most of the names were crossed out in red ink. Died 1995, died 2003, died 2008, but a few entries remained unmarked. He found Gerald Hoffman's number and realized he'd never updated it to reflect the man's death in 1994. 1994, the same year Stephen Liu died in his convenient car accident. Frank's finger traced down the list until he found another name that made his blood freeze. Dr. Ellen Richardson, NBC staff psychologist. She'd been the one called in after the incident, tasked with counseling the affected staff members. Frank remembered her calm voice, her reassuring promises that what they'd witnessed wouldn't define their careers. She'd been particularly interested in Frank's relationship with Sarah, how much his granddaughter meant to him. At the time, he'd thought it was therapeutic concern. Now he realized it was reconnaissance. Frank dialed her old number, expecting voicemail or disconnection. Instead, a familiar voice answered on the second ring. "Hello, Frank. I wondered when you'd call. Dr. Richardson." Frank's voice sounded hollow in his own ears. "You've been expecting me." For 37 years, there was satisfaction in her tone, the pleasure of a chess player revealing a long-planned strategy. "You were always the weak link, Frank. Too sentimental, too attached to people who could be leveraged. You're working with Marcus Hoffman. I've been working with Marcus since his father died." Gerald was paranoid about exposure, but he lacked vision. Marcus understands that the truth, properly presented, can be more valuable than any cover-up. Frank felt reality shifting beneath his feet. Dr. Richardson hadn't been treating the trauma survivors. She'd been cataloging their weaknesses, building psychological profiles for future exploitation. Stephen Liu became unreliable. Started having fantasies about book deals and movie rights. Some people can't handle the burden of important secrets. Her voice carried no remorse, only professional assessment. "You've handled it better, Frank. Turned yourself into a ghost. Very admirable self-discipline. What do you want?" "Your cooperation. A full confession about your role in the cover-up. Marcus has already produced a documentary about his father's complicity. Very touching, really. A son seeking to atone for his father's sins. Your testimony will add authenticity to his narrative of redemption." Frank gripped the phone tighter. "And if I refuse? Then your granddaughter's investigation into Reagan-era corruption will uncover some very interesting connections. Amazing how scandal spreads, Frank. Like cancer through a family tree." The line went dead, leaving Frank alone with the sound of his own ragged breathing and the terrible understanding that he'd never been free at all. The phone slipped from Frank's numb fingers, clattering onto the linoleum floor. The dial tone buzzed like an angry wasp before cutting to silence. He stood motionless in his kitchen, watching the shadows lengthen across the scattered photographs of Marcus Hoffman, understanding finally that his 37 years of exile had been an illusion. He'd never escaped. He'd simply been allowed to believe he had. The apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge that Richardson had been watching, cataloging, waiting. Every Tuesday morning at Mel's Diner, every birthday card purchased at the same Hallmark store, every phone call with Sarah, all of it documented, analyzed, weaponized. Frank's careful invisibility had made him the perfect target. He picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail, her cheerful voice promising to call back soon. Frank hung up without leaving a message. What could he possibly say? "Hello, sweetheart. Your grandfather helped cover up sexual assault, and now people are going to destroy your career to punish him for it." Instead, he called David, Sarah's boyfriend. The journalist answered on the second ring, sounding distracted. "Frank? Is everything okay? Sarah's in a meeting." "David, I need you to listen very carefully." Frank's voice sounded foreign to his own ears, steady in a way that surprised him. "Sarah's investigation into Reagan-era corruption. She needs to stop. Tonight." "What?" "Frank, what are you talking about? There are connections she doesn't understand. People who won't hesitate to hurt her to protect themselves." Frank closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's graduation photo in his mind. "I can't explain everything, but you have to trust me. Make her stop." "Frank, you're scaring me. What connections? What people? Just, please, keep her safe." Frank hung up before David could respond. The silence that followed felt absolute, like the quiet after an explosion. Frank walked to his bedroom and pulled out the suitcase he'd kept packed for 37 years, the go-bag of a man who'd always known this day would come. Inside were $15,000 in cash, fake identification papers Gerald Hoffman had provided in 1987, and a bus ticket to Seattle that had expired decades ago. He'd told himself the suitcase was paranoia, a security blanket for an old man's anxiety. Now he realized it had been preparation for war. Frank returned to the kitchen and spread Miranda's documents across the table alongside his own memories. The timeline she'd constructed was meticulous. Gerald Hoffman's death in 1994, Stephen Liu's accident 3 months later, Richardson's quiet transition from NBC psychologist to private practice specializing in trauma management. Every loose end carefully tied off except for Frank, who'd made himself so small and invisible that eliminating him would have drawn unwanted attention. Until now. Until Sarah's investigation threatened to expose the network of corruption that had protected Johnny's secret for 4 decades. Frank's hands moved without conscious thought, gathering the photographs into a neat stack. Marcus Hoffman's face stared up at him, and Frank could see the 12-year-old boy who'd watched his father orchestrate a cover-up, a child who'd learned that the truth was just another commodity to be bought and sold, and that justice belonged to whoever controlled the narrative. The cruelest part was the elegance of their plan. Marcus would emerge as a hero, the grieving son who'd finally found the courage to expose his father's complicity. Richardson would be the dedicated psychologist who'd spent decades documenting the trauma inflicted on innocent victims, and Frank would be the monster, the enabler who'd chosen silence over justice, who'd let a predator continue operating to protect his own career. The story would be perfect, because it was mostly true. Frank walked to his window and looked out at the street where he'd lived in hiding for so long. Mrs. Chen's television was playing the evening news, the anchors discussing the day's political scandals with practiced gravity. None of them understood that the biggest scandals were the ones that never made it to air, buried so deep that their victims couldn't even name what had been done to them. His phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. 16 days, Frank. Your granddaughter's meeting ends in 20 minutes. She'll call you excited about a breakthrough in her investigation. Imagine her disappointment when she learns the truth. Frank deleted the message and turned off the phone. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't let them use Sarah's voice as a weapon against him. He'd spent 37 years protecting her from the truth of who he really was. Now he had 16 days to decide whether that protection was worth preserving. The suitcase sat open on his bed like a mouth waiting to swallow his old life whole. Frank Morrison, the man who'd fled Hollywood in shame, could disappear tonight and never be found. but Sarah would still be destroyed by the truth. And Frank Morrison was tired of running. Frank closed the suitcase with deliberate finality and pushed it back under his bed. The sound it made sliding across the floor was like a door slamming shut on 37 years of cowardice. He walked to his kitchen table where the photographs of Marcus Hoffman lay scattered like evidence at a crime scene, and began making phone calls. The first was to Miranda. She answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting. "I'm not running," Frank said without preamble, "but I need everything you have on Richardson and Marcus. Every connection, every financial record, every piece of evidence that proves this is a coordinated attack." "Frank, they made a mistake." His voice carried a strength that surprised them both. "Richardson knew too much about our conversation. She's been monitoring my apartment, probably for years." "That's illegal surveillance, Miranda. Your specialty." A pause. "Then, I'll be there in an hour." The second call was harder. Frank dialed the number he'd memorized 40 years ago but never used, the private line Johnny Carson had given him during the early days of their partnership. It would be disconnected now, or transferred to estate managers, but Frank needed to try. He needed to speak to the ghost that had haunted his exile. The phone rang 3 times before an elderly woman answered. "Carson residence. This is Frank Morrison. I worked with Johnny on The Tonight Show." "Mr. Morrison." The voice warmed with recognition. "This is Eleanor, Johnny's assistant. He spoke of you often in his final years. Said you were the only one who understood what really mattered." Frank's throat tightened. "Eleanor, I need you to know that someone is planning to destroy Johnny's legacy. They're going to release footage from 1987, and they're going to lie about what it shows." "Mr. Morrison, Johnny told me about that night before he died. He wanted me to give you a message if you ever called." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of a secret carried too long. "He said to tell you that what you saw was him pulling that girl away from the NBC executive who was assaulting her. Johnny fired the man the next morning and personally paid for the girl's counseling. He made you leave because he needed you safe, not complicit." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. 37 years of guilt, of believing he'd witnessed Johnny committing assault, crumbled in an instant. He'd seen the aftermath of rescue, not attack. Johnny's shocking reply to Harrison Ford's public snub had been to quietly protect a young woman while cameras rolled, ending his own career moment to save someone else's life. "The girl," Frank whispered. "What was her name?" "Sarah Chen. She kept Johnny's name when she married. Lives in Pasadena now, actually, just a few blocks from you." Mrs. Chen, his neighbor of 15 years, the woman whose television sounds had comforted his lonely evenings. The victim he'd thought Johnny had assaulted was the elderly lady who'd waved at him from her garden every morning, who'd survived and built a quiet life in the same neighborhood where Frank had hidden in shame. Frank's third call was to David, Sarah's boyfriend. "Frank, thank God. Sarah just got home from her meeting and she's asking questions I can't answer. What's going on?" "Put her on the phone." Sarah's voice was tight with worry. "Grandpa, David said you called about my investigation. What connections? What people?" Frank closed his eyes and made the choice he should have made 37 years ago. "Sarah, I need to tell you about something that happened in 1987. Something I've been ashamed of my entire life. But first, I need you to know that I love you more than my own life, and everything I did was to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." "Grandpa, you're scaring me." "Good. Because some very dangerous people are about to try to use you to hurt me. But I won't let that happen." Frank's voice grew stronger with each word. "I'm done running, sweetheart. It's time to fight back." When Miranda arrived an hour later, she found Frank at his kitchen table surrounded by notebooks, a laptop borrowed from Mrs. Chen, and the focused intensity of a man who'd finally stopped being afraid. Sarah was on speakerphone, her journalism training evident, as she asked precise questions about dates, names, and evidence. "He's building a case," Sarah was saying. "If Richardson's been conducting illegal surveillance for decades, if Marcus has been using his media connections to suppress other victims' stories, then this isn't just about you, Grandpa. This is a pattern of abuse that's still happening." Frank looked up at Miranda, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just determination, but purpose. They thought I was weak because I loved someone more than myself, Frank said. They were wrong. That love is exactly what makes me dangerous. Frank Morrison's fingers moved across the laptop keyboard with surprising grace for a 71-year-old man who'd spent decades avoiding technology. The story poured out of him like water from a broken dam. Not just the facts Miranda needed for her investigation, but the emotional architecture of 37 years spent believing he'd failed the most important test of his life. Sarah's voice crackled through the speakerphone every few minutes with updates from her end. She'd contacted 3 other journalists whose Reagan-era investigations had been mysteriously derailed in the 1990s. The pattern Miranda had identified was even larger than they'd suspected. A network of former NBC executives, corporate psychologists, and media fixers who'd turned institutional cover-up into a profitable enterprise. "Grandpa," Sarah said during one of her check-ins, "I found something else. Marcus Hoffman's documentary company received a $500,000 grant last year from something called the Carson Legacy Foundation. But when I tried to trace the foundation's funding sources, they all led back to shell companies." Miranda looked up sharply. "Someone's been planning this for years, building financial infrastructure to make Marcus look legitimate when the story breaks." Frank nodded, unsurprised. Richardson had always been methodical. Even in 1987, she documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that information was currency. What he hadn't realized was that she'd been building a 40-year investment portfolio in human misery. By midnight, they had the framework of a counterattack. Sarah would publish her investigation into the surveillance network before Marcus could release his documentary. Miranda would file criminal complaints against Richardson for illegal wiretapping and harassment. Frank would provide testimony not just about the 1987 incident, but about the decades of psychological warfare that followed. "They'll still try to destroy you," Miranda warned. "Even with the truth on our side, the initial headlines will be brutal." Frank thought about the suitcase under his bed, about the man who'd packed it in shame and fear. Let them try. "I'm not the same person who ran away in 1987. Sarah had grown quiet on the phone. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Grandpa, can I ask you something? All these years, when I talked about wanting to be a journalist, wanting to tell stories that mattered, did you ever think about telling me yours?" Frank looked out his window toward Mrs. Chen's house, where a single light still glowed in the kitchen. Tomorrow, he would knock on her door and introduce himself properly. He would tell her about Johnny Carson's message, about Eleanor's revelation, about the 37 years he'd spent believing he'd witnessed her assault instead of her rescue. "I was afraid," he said simply. "Afraid you'd see me the way I saw myself." How was that? As a coward who chose silence when someone needed him to speak. Sarah's voice was firm. "That's not the grandfather I know. The grandfather I know spent his whole life protecting people he loved, even when it cost him everything." After Sarah and Miranda left, Frank sat alone in his apartment with the profound silence of a man who'd finally told the truth. The Emmy Awards on his shelves caught the streetlight from his windows, casting familiar shadows across the walls. For 37 years, those shadows had felt like accusations. Tonight, they looked like old friends saying goodbye. His phone buzzed one final time. Another message from the unknown number. "You've made a mistake, Frank, but it's not too late to reconsider. Some stories are too big for one old man to tell." Frank typed his response carefully. "You're right. Good thing I'm not alone anymore." He turned off the phone and walked to his bedroom, where the packed suitcase waited under his bed like a discarded skin. Instead of reaching for it, Frank opened his closet and selected his best suit. The one he'd worn to awards ceremonies 40 years ago, when he'd believed that telling stories mattered more than anything else in the world. Tomorrow, he would remember why he'd felt that way. Frank returned to his kitchen table and pulled out a piece of paper. At the top, in careful handwriting, he wrote, "The Truth About Johnny Carson," by Frank Morrison. Below that, he began the story he should have told decades ago, the story of a night when America's most beloved entertainer sacrificed his own moment of triumph to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. As dawn broke over Pasadena, Frank Morrison was still writing. Not the confession his tormentors expected, but the testimony his conscience demanded. Outside his window, Mrs. Chen tended her garden in the early morning light, surviving and thriving in the quiet way that real heroes always do. For the first time in 37 years, Frank Morrison was no longer afraid of the truth. And in that fearlessness, he found something he'd forgotten existed: peace.